everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Geopolitical Pico. Today, I'm really happy to introduce back Antonia Colibasanu. She's the Ops Director of Geopolitical Futures, and she was already here before, some maybe year and a half ago, explaining geoeconomics and so on. And today, we welcome you to be talking about the current economic system, how it's been developed, the economic situation in the world, and hopefully to have a great conversation. Obviously, Ronan, you're here with me. You're going to be directing because I think like you guys work together. So you have to perform today. You have to perform today. But yeah, how are you, Ronan?
Nice setup. We're feeling good.
Yes, we're feeling good.
And yeah, thank you, Antonia, for coming to join us. Now in person. Last time was online, I believe. So this is...
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to be in Prague and teach at the university about geoeconomics. Because obviously the other hat that I have, apart from being an analyst working with Ronan at Geopolitical Futures, is that of an associate professor at my hometown university in Bucharest. So, it's always a pleasure to be around students and explain what I do, which is not necessarily very easy considering the contemporary setting.
So I want to also mention that you don't just that, you're also associated with other institutes. I know that with the with Elcano, and like you definitely, I mean, given that the field that you speak about is not that well known, and it's also, you're one of the main proponents now also in development internationally in this area. So obviously you have to be really busy right now. You're going to have a lot of people. So we really appreciate that you take the time to be with us today.
I mean, it's a great time to be expert in geoeconomics, I would say, which is why we're talking about it today in many ways. So I think I want to start with just trying to understand the global trade system a bit better. I mean, everybody's heard about like the US dollar being the standard for trade around the world. Prior to that, obviously, we had the gold standard way back before World War II, and just kind of wondering how we got to this situation where US is this overarching dominant position by having the global reserve currency.
Sure. Well, it's a very complex topic. It's basically economic history that you're asking me to give in a few minutes. But going away from economic history themes, in short, in a nutshell, I would say that going back to the way that World War II ended is probably the key of for us to understand the present. So there were basically two stages in how the financial system works. First, after the World War II, we had the Bretton Woods institutions that basically built the world of international organizations and built the foundation of globalization as we know it. Now, those institutions were manufactured, if I can use this word, by the US. Why? Because the US was the only stable country and the only country that could actually fund anything after World War II, especially if we're talking about Europeans. So in parallel with the USSR system, the US basically funded the reconstruction of Western Europe in particular, and also as the US entered the Cold War, it also established the foundation, the economic foundation this time, to sustain its interest in the world. And that basically meant that these institutions were, and what institutions are we talking about? The IMF, the World Bank, and the so-called GATT, which later on got to be World Trade Organization. So to be a member of these institutions and to benefit from their funding, basically, and the membership, was to be an ally of the United States. Now, why was this good for a country? Because countries needed to trade with one another in order to build their economies. So, in that sense, the US was the security provider for international trade. Why would the US do that? Well, it's pretty simple. The U.S. imperative is to secure its borders, two of them being on the world's oceans, and secure its economic stability, making sense of competitive advantages that are not necessarily tied to manufacturing, but are tied to knowledge-based economy. So growing technologically and finding those areas where the U.S. could thrive and be profitable and prosper that are not necessarily that costly, but are providing for the population. And that was the foundation that was set up by the U.S. as a winner of World War II, and then as a winner of the Cold War, because this was actually what made the U.S. a superpower at the end of the Cold War. The framework that the U.S. built and secured, the attractiveness of prosperity that this network of alliances provided for other countries was actually the key for the Western success. It wasn't because, you have many weapons that Eastern Europeans, for instance, wanted to have the U.S. win the Cold War so they can go to Western Europe. It was the attraction of prosperity, and that prosperity was done through that system. Now, going back to the dollar. Now, at the very beginning of that, with Bretton Woods institutions, the dollar was convertible into gold. Why? Because the dollar needed to be out there, and the U.S. needed to fund the reconstruction process in Europe for its own interest, of course, but it needed to do so with dollars. Now, the more the U.S. funded, the more deficit it got. And then there was also the Vietnam War, which put pressure on the U.S. administration. So in the 70s, the U.S. said, well, we can't really sustain the dollar convertibility into gold because it's not to our advantage. So therefore, let's make it so that we have an advantage of the fact that we are funding everyone and of the fact that we are supporting this network that is also trade security in many ways. So that was the moment that we got into floating exchange rates. And that was the moment that the dollar basically became the gold in terms of reserve currency. Up to that point, we had gold standard, meaning everything was not necessarily convertible. That's not the word to use because convertibility is something else, but
tied to
the gold,
its values.
denominated into gold. Starting the 70s, everything was denominated into the dollar. Why? Because the system was built and it was large enough to sustain that. The dollar was known and it was trusted. And the key to the U.S. success and the dollar role as a reserve currency is not because the U.S. is a stable economy. It's not because the U.S. is so successful in what it is doing, but it is the fact that everyone in the world recognizes the dollar and trusts the dollar. So if you'd go in places in Africa, for instance, if you have a U.S. dollar in your pocket, you will be able to find your way out of any kind of situation.
I mean, having lived in Zimbabwe, people, as soon as they got their salaries, what do they trade it into? US dollars, wherever they can. They go to the street traders, and that's the currency that they trust, that they want to keep their money in because it has value that they can see more so than their own currency, right?
And that means that the US has the capacity also to leverage itself against the rest of the world in case they need to devaluate their currency or anything sort of the like, no? Like, because other country can devaluate with the dollar, but the US can do it with everyone else at once.
Well, yes, but this is why it has done it very cautiously.
Because that erodes the trust.
Because the moment that you get wild on getting this power and transform the dollar into a sort of a weapon, against the whole system, weaponizing the dollar, yes, it's possible.
Okay.
But it goes back as a boomerang effect,
Yeah.
which is basically the world no longer trusts you and starts to find other alternatives.
And this trust is, you're mentioning the reasons, but is this trust also in the stability of the American economy, in the stability of its growth, or is it like pure trust as in like really abstract trust?
It's both. Let me explain how. Well, someone operating in the Iranian black market, where the dollar can be exchanged, even if officially it is not, right, in the country, does not necessarily care about the stability of the U.S. economy. He trusts that having dollars and exchanging dollars is good business. Why? Because the dollar is known. Why? Because there is enough amount of dollars in the international market to secure his acquisition of dollars or his selling. So in other words, you can cash in on operations on dollars. So that's the abstract, which is not very abstract if you think about it. It's very practical.
It's everywhere, so you have access to it. You will be
Exactly.
able to exchange.
Exactly. It's the currency that you will have access no matter what. Now, the stability of the U.S. economy ties into the value of the dollar. And that stability is linked to its trade. And it is also linked to how much dependency the dollar has on the international market. So in many ways, the stability of the dollar is tied into how much the dollar is used in international transactions. And being used in international transactions means that the U.S. is also tied to you in some way or another. So if you're Romanian, or if you're Czech, or if you are, Peruvian, you are tied to the U.S. and you are part of that U.S. stability because you are using the contract, the dollar in the contracts that you have with the rest of the world, even if you're not American. I mean, a contract between someone in Chile, for instance, and someone from Romania is denominated in U.S. dollars.
I heard this was like, I've heard from other people that this is like US's superpower in some way, that they're able to spread this around, and that inherently gave them this financial system which allowed them to continue to run deficits year after year because people are always willing to buy US debt in the form of treasury bonds.
Exactly.
Is that right? So then when we say, okay, the US has got unsustainable deficit, it's not entirely true, because for many years we've seen them able to sell that deficit abroad because people are always happy that they're going to get a return on that because of this system of trade, which has come about, that everybody trusts the US dollar. And kind of, if that was to go, then the treasury bond market would also crumble and we'd end up going into a new world, basically.
Yeah.
That's my layman's understanding of the situation.
Well, that's, it's the basic understanding of the situation, and it's very correct, because it is about what you buy and what you sell. So the moment, and we've seen this recently, the moment that uncertainty went high, the volatile markets, that was the moment that U.S. Treasury bonds were sold, because trust. Plus, you need that in order to manage your own monetary power on your own currency. So a lot of these countries that use dollars and have U.S. Treasury bonds are also exporters. And when you are an exporter, you need to devalue your currency to make your exports competitive against the dollar market. So against the dollar market, that is against the whole financial system. So you were basically seeking ways to get your currency devalued in the moment where the market cannot function for you. And that's the moment you are selling U.S. Treasury bonds.
which is like the motivation for countries to buy treasury bonds, to have this leverage against the market to control their own situation.
Exactly. So others would buy just because you are thinking that in the future you might need this power as well. Power and quote
And
unquote.
if I'm not wrong, Japan has the highest holdings, but like a lot of export markets, like you said, China has significant holdings of US Treasury bonds as well, and like they're all able to use
European
those.
Union, I remember that
European
they also have, after 2008 crisis, I believe that they were also buying a lot. Yeah.
Because the US is the biggest integrated national market.
Yes.
So it's a nation state that has the biggest market. So it's impossible not to be dependent on that. So the moment you are dependent on a market, you are thinking about ways to hedge your position in case you need to. So therefore, you are buying debt so that you have a hold on that country. And you have a hold on that country, not because you want to do something against that country, but because you want to manage your own trade balance.
I always had one question regarding the debt and purchasing and then selling. Who do you sell the debt to? Like, let's say now, and I think we can already start getting into like what's happening lately and what brought us here. If a country decides to sell it, let's say Japan and China decide to send 10 to 15% of their US Treasury bonds, who are they selling these bonds to? Who is the... where does it go? Because I assume it's got to go somewhere else, no? That ownership.
Sure. Other countries.
Other countries.
Other investment funds. Buyers. Well, probably not individuals, but banks, commercial banks. So the market to sell this and buy this is the financial market, which obviously has the primary financial market where you effectively exchange these titles and assets against one another, and the secondary market where you value the risk of your own decision making when you're buying or selling something. So the financial market is basically indicating, and through the process of decision making of investors, is valuing the assets.
So like in the stock market.
It's pretty much the same thing.
I would say, just to be clear, like a treasury bond is basically buying US government debt, which has a fixed return on investment, usually around, it very rarely moves that rate of yields from that interest, right? So it's usually maybe 4%, 4.2% or something like this at the moment. And it's pretty stable long term. So you can say 10 years in the future, we're still going to be getting a 4.2% return on our investment annually, which is not as much as you can make potentially on the stock market in general, but it's more stable, lower risk, and so more consistent return. Is that?
So if you were afraid of risk, of taking risks, you will invest in bonds in general. Of those bonds, the most secure is the US Treasury bond because everyone wants it. And because it is, again, spread around the world. And that keeps it stable.
Okay. And that's based on trust.
Exactly.
It's
all tied together. That's what I was saying. Like the whole international market is tied to this whole system when you have to go back to the start to understand how it's so integrated now and how it's all built around this trust that is being developed over 80 years in the US, being this hegemonic economic power, basically.
Which is, bottom line, is founded on the fact that the US was the only country that was relatively stable, less affected by the war, and could manage. So
it's a moment of imbalance where the US...
Yeah. So it was better off, therefore it could work with the world. And it couldn't just let the world be, because obviously you cannot be alone in the world. Just as an individual, a country needs relations.
Well, that brings me to the elephant in the room, which is the current White House decision-making since the inauguration in January this year, and how potentially the narrative that's being pushed is that they do want to do this alone, that they're trying to isolate themselves from global markets. And we've seen the threats of tariffs against the whole world, which were obviously paused for 90 days. And there's been little movement on any sort of trade deals about negotiations. So it's quite possible that might happen again, like a extension of that global tariff. But we have seen on China, obviously, very harsh tariffs in some ways. And still just like this threat of tariffs as a blanket strategy, I think goes away from that common understanding of the US market being integrated with everyone and benefiting from their position as from globalization, and basically being able to leverage their position for advantage that they have been able to do, and has enabled them to become to see this massive growth in their economy over the last 50 years consistently.
Well,
It's a big topic.
it is a big topic, but it is an important topic because in geoeconomics, one of the most important lessons we learn when we're talking about geoeconomics is dependencies are important, some more than others. And dependencies are basically referring to two elements. One is investment. The other one is trade. Now, the two are linked because you cannot really sustain trading without having growth in investment. Now, there is also, in the liberal sense of the word, okay, the more trade, the more competitive. Why? Because your investment will go into those comparative advantages that you will sustain in order to sell more, to be more profitable. So the market teaches you about the opportunity cost, not just about making choices, but about using those choices for your own profit. That's in a sense what the globalization was all about. And that's where the power of the United States and the power of the West came from, because they've learned to make use of the opportunity costs in order to grow and develop their economies on the so-called knowledge base. So using the knowledge and learning what you are doing best, making sure you make the right choices when you are doing something, and applying that to the international market. Now, right now, we are at a point when we've seen the negative aspects of doing just that without management. Or we seem to believe that we need management. And this is also tied to trust in many ways. So in 2008, when we had the financial crisis, the population said, I need a government back.
Yeah, I lived that one.
We all did. I need the government back. Why? Because I need protection. The financial market is so integrated that the governments did not have a hold on it. It was, the general wisdom, quote unquote, that the banking system is very much integrated into the financial market and therefore very decoupled from whatever the government would impose. That was not necessarily very much true, because the banking system is still a part of the national economy in every country. It is not just off the charts, right? But since then, we had the population of the world generally asking for governments to step in. And whenever they couldn't step in, all they had to say, and this is mostly about politicians too, all they had to do was to say, I want to step in. I mean, if the population wants you to say that, you'll say it because you want vote. You're going on the other important market, the political market of voting. Well, Now, the financial crisis passed. It left some traumas behind. Then those traumas compiled with others, in Europe in particular, with the migration crisis trauma, which has to do with the way we allocate resources, which is very much financial. It's not about caring about the refugees or not. It is about how we allocate resources better within the system that we live. So again, protection against what? Protection against them not getting my money.
Mm-hmm.
It's, very selfish, but very much natural. Then we went through another shock, which was called the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond the financial markets, we saw the problems related to the integration of trade. And again, the population said, oh my God, I cannot get my shopping done on time. I have to wait for 3-4 days to get whatever I bought on Amazon or whatever.
Which is crazy because that's something new. That availability of all of these, it's something
People get
new.
used to it very fast.
Yes, but really, really fast. I mean, but it's completely new. I mean, 2015, that was not a case in most of Europe. Maybe in the United States it was, but definitely not in Europe. So, I mean.
Very good point. Society evolves.
Absolutely.
With it, we have the good sides of things. We want the good sides of things. We want technology. We want the world to be interconnected because this is how I work with Ronan every day, right? At Geopolitical Futures, we do not have an office. We only work online. We debate.
I've waited at the door when you guys were having those conversations. Yeah, I had to wait. Yes.
See? So you have to give space for the online conversations, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what if there is no online conversation? Oh my. However, that online conversation is about dependencies that we love because we can have that exchange.
Exactly.
In other cases, oh my, I don't want to pay for Europeans, Asians, Africans, Latin Americans, because those dependencies, if I'm an American, harm me. So wait a second. You do love the technological dependency that allows you to work with people all around the world for that competitive edge, but at the same time, you hate those dependencies that have you waiting for an extra day when getting your box from the mailman, right?
Yeah.
And why is that? Because, all of a sudden we have a problem with supply chains. So we have a problem with resource allocation. We have a problem with understanding what is right for us and what is wrong for us in the sense of allocating those resources, as David Ricardo and Adam Smith taught us about comparative advantage and therefore opportunity cost. So we go back at the very beginning, which basically means that right now the political atmosphere is I want more protection because I don't want the supply chains to collapse. I want more of the good things. I still want the technological advantage and I still want the internet. It's lovely. I mean, don't get me wrong. But you have to do something about what I don't like. And I also don't have jobs that, may allow me to be a competitor with places that get that box into my house through the mailman. Okay? Which means jobs for manufacturing.
Yes, but as far as I understand, developed economies went from secondary to tertiary. So they went to services, and they, like, industry went back, and agriculture. But again, that's part of that competitive advantage that with the jobs, with the amount of jobs in those areas, it was sufficient to sustain the services in these developed countries. Now, what I do understand from, like, in what I understand there is that there has not been done a proper, as you were saying, allocation of resources once this transfer to services happens. There is no acknowledgement of these jobs that are going to be lost. And I can see it happening. For example, we had the episode on AI and how can it affect the job market. I don't know if it's because of my own conditions back home, but for us, the main nightmare is I need to find a job. I mean, I come from Spain. We have I remember seeing some charts that were amazing. We were competing with Iraq in unemployment rate. So not that long ago. Now, or at least we're a little bit better. But yeah, I think that, or at least what I perceive is that neither these institutions internationally, neither any of the main trade poles have understood or have put an effort on diversifying their economy or in trying to make their economy resilient to these job losses. And that's what affects more the political perspective of the people. And that's what I see in the United States. The United States has not known how to turn its population that was working in agriculture, that was working in the industry, in the iron area, and so on. It has not known how to bring them back to either the job market onto a sort of economic situation where they wouldn't be feeling so unequal. And I think that's in the core. I don't know if I'm wrong.
But isn't this the inherent contradiction with like neoliberalism in general? Because we have like this growing inequality in the richest countries in the world because of this exact reason, where companies are for profit first and foremost, and the people that are in those companies, for instance, are going to get richer and richer. Well, as you said, the lower income manufacturing jobs are the ones that are lost, and you can't go back from that in any easy way.
But not even just those. I mean, jobs that were valued, like that they had a medium value or even a medium high value, let's say 20 years ago. But these jobs are lost. You have a standard of life and you have a standard of living. And then there is no alternative for you. And that alternative will not come from the companies because the companies have one goal and it's profit. But the states or these financial institutions, I don't know, should have a wider perspective into the situation, no? Because in the end, like, they need to survive. The company may go bankrupt, but the state has to, and or the institution. I mean, I don't know.
Well, it's a matter of how we perceive the state, and in what you were saying, in a sense, you were seeing the state as a savior. But the fact is, the state does not have a business knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
So it lacks the ability of allocating resources because it's not done for that. It's done for, taking care of your human rights, making sure that you have the proper infrastructure to develop a business, and other elements. Well, making sure that you have the proper infrastructure to develop a business is an economic function. It's not a business function, but it is an economic function. So what do we mean by that? And yes, that is at the core of things. Getting resources allocated properly, especially human resources, is what turned into a socioeconomic problem in the US. Now, some say that it is the extreme neoliberalism that got them there. Others say that it is not that. It is actually the state incentives that were not necessarily calculated properly because the state cannot understand the business world and because it was supportive of areas that were not necessarily driven back to work, re-entered into the workforce as human resources, and therefore were left out. So to give an example of Romania, There are areas in Romania where you had a lot of incentives because there were industries that collapsed after the end of the Cold War and in the transition process. And governments had to give some subsidies to make, the basic income for those regions. The problem is that humans adapt fast. And humans adapted so well to the basic income that right now they have no incentives in going away from those regions. And they got accustomed on living off that basic income, which effectively made those regions poor. Because there is no incentive of creating businesses, considering their human resources there do not want to go back to work, but they're okay with just cashing in whatever the state gives. And the state cannot stop the giving, because if it does, then, well, what about the votes, first and foremost? And second, what do you do with a collapsed region? So it's in between. That was a trap. And that kind of a trap appears when the state gets more and more involved. But the state needs to get involved because the population calls for protection. And we have that protection understood in politics as populism, which is even more and more visible today. I mean, I can fix things. How? I don't know. I can fix things. I can do things better. How? Well, we'll see. Just vote for me, and then I'll make it work.
Yeah, we can go with the great proponent of that right now, if you want.
Well, I mean, there's a few in Europe as well.
There's one in Europe, but I think there's one that has taken the lead.
Obviously, when we talk about the U.S. president himself, like we have this same narrative that he can fix all the problems in America by uncertain means, I would say. Like
his
tariffs.
word.
It's his second favorite word, I think.
First is the Bible?
After God, or then tariffs. But yes, tariffs, I mean, we had a whole episode on tariffs, which I guess is a more layman's understanding of tariffs than you can provide. But obviously, he's using this to try and address these problems, or seemingly in a populist manner, trying to claim that this is going to bring these manufacturing jobs back, get these areas being productive again, because I guess they're the poorer areas now. We see these industries closed down. As you said, nothing moved into the place to replace them. And his idea, I mean, this is not new for Trump. If you look at his interviews, even way back in the 1980s, this is part of his ideology, that you need to bring these manufacturing jobs back. Regardless of what other economists might think, this is very much at his core beliefs, right? That he thinks that this is essential for the US to be prosperous. They should never have closed down manufacturing jobs.
But they closed them because of this competitive advantage that we were speaking about before. I mean, in the end, the U.S.
is a service-based.
The U.S. is a service-based economy. You have the countries surrounding you that were cheaper for your companies to produce there. Like, it's not that
exactly.
It's not that a Mexican company took jobs from the U.S. and brought them to Mexico. It's that an American company was like, okay, cost benefit, good. I'm going to Tijuana. And that's the issue. Like, it's not a Mexican company. It's an American company, or it's an American company that went to China and produced in China, or I mean, that's the core. But how has that affect actually?
Outsourcing. Well, I would say first, Trump is a populist, but is also the U.S. president that deals with a very complex environment. What do I mean by that? He may have gotten into power using, a populist speech manners. But once in power, he needs to deal with those areas that are now depopulated. There is a lot to be said. And obviously, the political speech has resources. It can get creative, and you can build fake trust, because eventually that trust is very much likely to go away if you're not doing something. And he is aware, I think, that he needs to fix things internally, and he needs to show that he's serious. And I believe this is where his decision about tariffs come from in the first place. Now, not to say that it's good or bad what he's doing, but just trying to be objective about what he's done. So far, on the positive side, he showed the voters that he's willing to take steps. And that's a positive that he will cash in. He also pushed forward some negotiations with countries. It is kind of impossible to believe, at least for a reasonable economist, that you can fully decouple from China. Not to mention that getting investments from China is a problem, is not necessarily a solution for the American state. And we can go into why that is, but that's also tied to public debt and all the rationale around it. The other thing that he managed to do in the process is having the Europeans think about securing themselves. Because obviously him portraying a very serious administration when the U.S. says, I'm no longer willing to offer the protection that we've offered so far, is a message received by countries in Europe that sounds like, okay, so you do not want to decouple from China, you also want to decouple from Europe, which is something that is actually quite possible because we are talking about two developed economies. If we're talking about integrated European Union, where from an economy standpoint, you actually have someone to talk over the phone because you have an integrated market. Mm-hmm. When we're talking security, yeah, there are many countries, defense policies, and so on. But President Trump made something possible now. With the integrated economy, you have those who are aware that there are very different defense policies in Europe, thinking about how we can find ways to coordinate these defense policies. So that's actually a step forward if we're looking at European integration when it comes to full integration, political integration. It's integrating the security of Europe into an economic framework, which, by the way, is the very foundation of integration. If you manage that, you're going to manage the political aspect because eventually you're going to talk about fiscal policies that work for investment in defense and security. And that is going to be a first step into building up what the European defense industry is, because there is a defense industry. Europeans are selling weapons to other places in the world. Now, the question, and that goes on the negative side of what President Trump managed, is the question that he and his administration will have to answer is, how much loss can I actually sustain for the American defense industry while I'm supporting the European defense industry? I as America.
Yeah, that's actually...
That's one thing. The other thing is, also on the negative side of things, if you are going away from liberalism, and if you are going away from the strategy that built the networks, then you have to prepare for a restructuring world around you. So, is the U.S. really looking and planning for a place where the oceans that it borders are not necessarily fully secured and controlled by the US, and other places, other countries control those oceans as well and share that with the US. Is the US ready to talk about how the oceans are going to be secured? Because if yes, then we are looking to another management, quote unquote, for the international economy, the global economy. So we're going to have a different kind of globalization. But the key questions in the negative, because they may go into a place where the US loses power because it loses control over defense strategies for the world and over controlling, loses control over the shipping lines that are very much essential for the US economy.
Yeah, I think we were talking yesterday about this as well, and I said I can't imagine in the CEO's office of Lockheed Martin, for instance, that they're very happy with the way this is playing out, because he said Trump has managed to do what Europe themselves have been unable to do for decades, which is move closer together in that security sphere, and for the European defense industry to actually get serious about being a player, which we actually had an episode on a few weeks ago. But then that also brings me to my last question, I guess, which is, I mean, just recently Joseph Nye passed away, and he was the inventor, I guess, of this concept of soft power. And so all the way we're talking about how this economy leverage is used by the US, and we talked about briefly the IMF and the World Bank, for instance, and how I think that was able for the US to project their values across the world. So we talk about loans to Africa, for instance. If they're giving loans to a country, they always come with some stipulations around democratization or human rights and all these different things which we in the West take as our core values, I guess. And they're able to export that soft power through these economic instruments and institutions. And this move away from or this isolationist kind of mentality, I guess, will take away from the value of the World Bank. It'll be an IMF, and we'll see other. I mean, we've already seen, obviously, the BRICS Bank I don't take particularly seriously, but it's trying to be in that same space where they can push their own values tied to this economic incentives in a different way, and trying to take over that soft power space. And I wondered, what do you think about like the future for US soft power in this environment where we see like this system changing and reshaping around specifically these economic actions that are being taken?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And I was actually thinking that it is very symbolic, him passing away, Joseph Nye passing away now. And in a way, that speaks of the world we're living. Soft power.
Metaphor of the
Soft power is being redefined, maybe, if we are hopeful. You don't seem particularly hopeful.
I am not. I have a. I mean, I come from history, so I do try to make historical analysis of things, and that's scary. That it's fairly scary because of like the potential developments. Because I was thinking in that you're saying values. I see that the IMF or these organizations, for example, have helped the spread of economic liberalism all over the world. Like I can come up with many countries where they basically changed or they modified substantially their economic system in order to be able to get the IMF loan. And that makes it stable. I don't know, like these theories of liberalism that within liberal democracies there's no wars, blah blah. Although there was one, there's been a couple. There was at least one. So yeah, I just see like more of a, as you were connecting with your population evolves, I see that the changes that may come are not that necessarily, we may not be able to actually see them coming because the changes may be more radical or faster than we're expecting them, just given the current situation.
Yeah, well, the way I'm thinking about the world now and the world and the future, there has been an abuse of the word restructuring. The global system is restructuring. And I've used it also in my analysis. And during the last few months, I realized that to restructure something, you actually need a goal, scope for restructuring.
And
You need to have a vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, you need to establish, talking about values, talking about soft power, okay, establish what is the purpose. Why am I taking these actions? Right now, it does not seem very clear why the US is taking the actions. I mean, if it is for supporting the European independence, quote unquote, because again, one cannot be fully independent. Even as an individual, you cannot be fully independent because you cannot live alone. That's the idea. If it is to support the American independence, again, what do you want to make? Make America alone? That's not exactly the purpose here. So, considering that there has to be some relationship within the complex system of the world, we are now in a phase of destructuring what we have. Without having a goal, without having a purpose, it is pretty clear that, Europe is trying to get together on defense and security. It's not going to be done tomorrow. It's not going to be done in 5 years. It's probably not going to be done even in a decade. Who knows? But we have some wild cards on the table. I mean, history. Thinking about what Germany and the German economy and its technology and how it helps various defense industries in the world right now, including the American defense industry. I cannot help but thinking, after hearing you, I come from history and it's not very, maybe there won't be a decade until we see growth in the defense industry of Europe/Germany with the German competitive edge in some technology. Because there were periods in history wherein we thought Germany cannot get out and do things again. And it could. It wasn't for our own good, but it could. So, taking for granted things like, okay, Europe cannot do anything. What is Europe? It's nothing. Saying that a lot of times may actually trigger the opposite.
That's actually what we've discussed many times, that reaction, that more than I would say I disagree with the current American administration wanted Europe more independent. They wanted to have a bigger leverage, but in a way, we both see it as an opportunity for Europe to actually get that strategic independence in many fields. And with that, I want to ask my final question. It would be, we've spoken about the U.S. distrust and everything, but where does the European Union, especially Europe, the European Union, shifting and making other partnerships that may decouple itself from the United States, or is it not?
Or do you include Japan and South Korea in that as well?
We're in Japan,
Similar.
Australia, all these countries that have been like really close. I mean, that we consider in the Western sphere, including Japan and South Korea. Do you think like they will go, and it's a moment for China in the end to grow, to nurture these economic relations with them?
Well, first of all, Europe, as European Union this time, is the most integrated and the second important market of the world. If we're taking for national standards, it's the most important market of the world if we're taking it as an organization market, which basically puts it on the very same level with the US. So when we are talking about Europe economic power, considering the stability that it enjoys right now, as opposed to decision making that is not necessarily understood, even if it's planned or thought through, it's not understood by the markets. The European powerhouse is increasingly visible at the global stage. It has free trade agreements with Japan, for instance, and it works on a free trade agreement with India. It has a very complex relationship with China, where the European Union started de-risking not because it wanted to play on the US rhythm, but because it needed to de-risk on some sectors. The problem of the European Union economy and its stability is internal and stands for policies that need to be less bureaucratic, maybe, and more liberal in the classical sense of liberalism. Okay. So resource allocation and the rest done not through bureaucracy, but done for real. But talking about rebalancing, Europe is also destructuring. So de-risking from China is the European process of destructuring. Engaging more with India, with Korea, with Japan is part of the process of destructuring. And I do believe that if the US is going to maintain a sort of a balancing act with regards to the global market, maintaining its comparative advantage in the world's, let's say, security provider for international shipping, which it had been for a long time. Now, if that happens, the transatlantic link is going to stay. Now, if the US is willing to share the control over international shipping lines with other alliances, other countries, the transatlantic link will stay, but it will be part of a network of links that the European Union will need to build. And I think this is why we have the discussion with Japan, we have the discussion with India, because the European Union needs that, just in the very same way that the US needs that. So economically, the US balances and the European Union balances the very same network. In security, we have a connection, and both powers are mimicking each other in the structuring. Now, how they will restructure, meaning what will come out of this, we shall see. But I don't think that the EU, to answer a very particular question, I don't think that the EU will become closer to China, because there is no interest in doing so.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Antonia. I think we've covered a lot of ground there.
Yes.
In these beautiful Charles University offices.
Yes.
But that was very enlightening. I think it goes back to what George is saying at the moment. Our boss, George Friedman, saying we're living in an unanchored world in some way, where this destructuring process is basically leaving it up for, like, in a current where we can not see where it's going to finish and this end state. But very interesting.
No, well, then thank you very much, Antonia Colibasanu, for being with us today. Thank you for this conversation, really enlightening, and hopefully we will have you again.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching. Stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you very much, Ronan, and we'll see you next time. The Geopolitical Pickle is created by Ronan Wordsworth and Juan Francisco Muñoz. Follow us on Instagram at The Geopolitical Pico or Twitter at The GeoPico for more content, and follow us on every podcast platform.